Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, fighters. Am I leaving anyone out? I think, Gellert, if I was in a in another space, I was going to start a song. My worry is I'm not sure if people will then follow suit, but I'm sure comrades know that song. As Gillard said, my name is Tsepo Mutsepe. I'm the General Secretary of Equal Education. Excuse me. Excuse my voice as well. Equal Education is a movement of young people in South Africa. We are advocating for an equal and quality education, particularly for poor learners in the country. And these are young people who will go through schooling for 12 years, and they will be dependent on job security. Therefore, the discussions on the national minimum wage have got far-reaching impact, a far-reaching impact as compared to the beneficiaries whom we are probably advocating for now. And the unions would know that for a trade union movement to sustain itself, it not only needs to invest in its membership, but it also needs to have an interest in what is happening in education. With that said, I think the session which I'm chairing, and I'm looking forward to learning quite a lot from, is around the institutional framework for setting, increasing, and enforcing the national minimum wage. And I think some of the questions which were asked in the earlier sessions were around how do we make sure that people are held accountable? That is why I said I wanted to sing that song, because that song speaks about enforcing, but I'll sing it. Our first speaker is Bandile Ngidi. He's a director of the youth-led research and advocacy NGO Rethink Africa. He previously worked as a researcher in the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative. He's an MCOM candidate in development theory and policy from University of the Witwatersrand. Bandile has a background in social dialogue with research interest and experience in entrepreneurship, minimum wages, inflation, entrepreneurship and philosophy of science, philosophy of race, moral and political philosophy. Now, Bandile is going to be focusing on the elements of poverty and how the national minimum wage can transform society and can transform how the current structure of giving people minimum wage, the one that we're advocating for is not going to make sure that it reinforces the current poverty trajectory. Bandile, over to you, sir.
My name is Bandile Ngidi. As I've been introduced, thank you for the introduction. And I will be presenting today some of the research, and doing a bit of a literature review of the research that's come from a paper I've written for the research initiative called Setting a National Minimum Wage in the Context of Workers' Needs. The main point of what I'm going to do today is offer some contextual factors we need to think about in the design of the national minimum wage that will need to go into the design, such as how the level it's set at and how it's operated. And my main, that's the main point of my talk. I'm glad to see the other people who are also not coming from a strictly economics perspective, the trade unionists and whatever, but I'm really glad to be here. So I'll just get to the outline of my presentation. I'll talk about, very briefly, the context of the South African labor market just over time, a bit about employee protection, and then these meatier questions that set the context, such as how we think about workers' needs and related to the level, but also some facts about working poverties and sort of two key contextual things we need to think about, namely cost pressures that poor households and workers face, and I'm treating those two sort of together, but also interdependencies between households and some of the literature that's been offered there. Cool. So there's a lot of stuff I'm going to go into. If you were to just summarize what the big idea of what I want to get through is that these research insights look at one, a situation that workers find themselves in. So a situation of both job precarity or job precariousness and household precariousness. And that's the big idea. So of the tons of things I'm going to say today, that's what you should be taking away. I think the design of a national minimum wage as a legislated wage floor should be taking care of those things. But yeah, as I said, I'll go through the state of protection and how we think about these things. So cool, very briefly, workers in South Africa over the last 20 years find themselves in a situation where they've had very flat real wages over time. So since the dawn of democracy, their real wages have not grown at all, and they have a very low share of wages in South Africa. This very briefly just shows the amounts of inequality. I mean, some of the differences between, if you look at formal sector, between the mean and the median, there's almost a 6,000 Rand difference. So that's high inequality, you see, and the lowest sectors have very compressed wage structure. So there's not much difference between agriculture, the mean and the median in agriculture, but in some of the other sectors, there's a lot of difference. And very crucially, as the point has been made before, wages are the key to inequality here in South Africa. State grants play their role at the very bottom, but it's really to understand wage overall inequality in South Africa. The wages plays a very important role. As you can see there, 62% of the wage inequality is because of the inequality of wage income amongst the 72% of households that do not have access to wage income. That's just to set the context, right? In South Africa, but here's the point. So this minimum wage is so important contextually, given how over the last 20 years we haven't been able to move away from this historical exploitation of workers in South Africa. So when we arrived in democracy, there were these lofty ideals, high ambitions to reform the sort of exploitation, but through the ambitious exploitation set in our labor legislation. But as we've seen, there's been a number of challenges that have required strong social partners but haven't had them. High increase in informality and casualization, increase in temporary employment services, outsourcing, labor brokering, etc. We've had a fracturing labor market, ineffective enforcement mechanisms from the state side, but also the many challenges that collective bargaining has faced in South Africa. Cool. This is just the extent of wage coverage, and this is what I'm putting to the fore to you as to how important a national minimum wage would be. This is taken, if you look at, it's a whole 47% of people that are covered by sectoral determinations in the so-called vulnerable sectors, and it's sort of discussion how effective they are. But there's a whole 10% of poor workers under a certain threshold that are simply uncovered by any wage setting mechanism. Cool. So the main point of a national minimum wage is to ensure that workers' wages, low wage workers are protected from poverty. But how we think of poverty is actually very, very important. And it's, the literature, social sciences have not answered that question. You can think of it in a very minimalistic sense, which is a lack of some basic commodities, or you can think of it sort of the way Amartya Sen does it, which is a lack of access to opportunities and ways of being that you value. But one measure that we've had is the cost of, that's emerged, as Arden spoke about, I won't go much into it, the cost of basic needs line, money metric poverty line, developed by Soldru, and then just in comparison, there's one by Stats SA that was done. So what a cost of basic needs line is just a measure of what one person per month would need in order to not be in poverty. 960 Rand per person per month, according to Stats SA, that 1319, according to Soldru. But then there are many criticisms to this. So what I'm offering then is that we need to remember that these measures are very minimalistic. So how it's calculated, it's a very statistically rigorous process, but it basically captures the income. It treats as poor those people who are just meeting their food requirements. So maybe in the question and answer session we'll talk about how that happens, but a level of 1319 means it's a household that per capita is just meeting their minimum energy intake requirements. And that's very, very low. Historically, that's how wages have been set. The poverty lines of historically in South Africa, that's how they've been calculated. And sort of, if we're still at that stage where we're treating poverty in this very minimalistic sense, I don't think we'll achieve the gain sort of our constitution requires. But also, this minimalistic poverty line also hides many of the complexities of access to resources and regional differences that, the multidimensional aspects of poverty. So we must always keep that in mind when you think about how we use this line to set a range that the minimum wage must be set at, right? Cool. Stuff from yesterday, the dependency ratio from the NID starter shows that there's 3 dependents per worker. And the NID starter sort of tries very hard to capture those who are even outside the households that depend on a certain wage, but there's sort of the complexities I'll get to slightly later. Cool. And we use these 2 things, this poverty line and this dependency ratio, to arrive at the working poor line that Arden discussed yesterday. So this is sort of how you need to see the next couple of graphs. Here I have it by overall. Sorry, it's just cut off there. On the left, it's just overall from the sample of workers from the LMSDA, I think, data set. And those who are sort of the blue and the red are workers who who are earning below, the proportion of workers who are earning below this 4125 poverty line. Here it's divided up by sector, so you can see some of the inequalities. But if you look below the top of the red line, that's the extent of working poverty you have according to these different indicators, which I haven't been given time to go into. But also, you can see the differences in poverty by geotype and also by gender. So this is what we need to understand, this complexity of working poverty and this that exists, that could be alleviated by the setting of an appropriate minimum wage. Cool. The last thing then would be on the household side, in this brief time that I've been given. On the household side, what we need to understand, what we need to feed into the design of a national minimum wage would be looking at the cost pressures that poor South African households have, right? So there's evidence by Finn, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the other co-writers of that paper, who've looked at how price inflation has been anti-poor for the last 20 years for the very poorest households. So it's been that poverty, absolute poverty is decreasing, but this has been dampened by the fact that poorer households face slightly higher inflation. And the reason for that is mainly because they consume a smaller basket of goods, and so exposed to the particular inflation, especially food inflation. So if you're spending, on average, sort of like 30%, 40% of your household budget on food, as soon as food increases, and this is something that's very topical, that exposure will put you in a very precarious position. And that's so that's also confirmed by research done by Oosthuizen, looking at inflation inequality. So households with, say, unskilled workers versus skilled workers, or unionized workers versus ununionized workers, show signs of having slightly higher price inflation for this reason. So one random stat is that the majority of households with reliance on mainly unskilled work spent 60 months above the average all-urban inflation rate, but compared to skilled worker households, we spent just 50 months. So yeah, that's one thing that's going to need to feed into the design. But also, there's a broader context. So not just from price inflation, there's a context of a very low social wage and social security system in South Africa. So our poor healthcare, our poor infrastructure means that a certain wage might need to go much further than just the wage earner and sort of their consumption needs, plugging in needs like, or plugging in sort of the needs that arise from our poor social wage and social security infrastructure. Cool. And that's just a graph on the wage trends. At the very bottom, I'm very sorry that it's cut off, but the green line is on particular wage items, particular items in the CPI. So like public transport is much higher. Food follows a much higher pattern, and as poorer households are more exposed to this type of pressure, it's something that will need to feed into the design of the national wage. This is data from year-on-year monthly CPI index data from January 2008 to November 2014. Cool. And the last bit is some of the literature which is, has arisen looking at household dynamics. So a lot of the literature shows, and I'll maybe go into it in the question and answer session, high interdependence and pooling of resources amongst poorer households. So as in the context of unemployment, unemployed people receive their sustenance from employed people. There's been high migration and remittances, a long history of sending remittances back to rural households, this type of thing. So there is a lot of interdependence and on the poor and between the unemployed and the employed. And so we need to consider that wages must go further even than the normally defined household. So, households are defined very in a narrow way for statistical purposes in household surveys, but there's a lot of literature that points to the fluidity, especially in rural households, the fluidity of households and who receives a certain wage. Yeah. Cool. This was just a graph on how, from the work by Ben Scully, looking at for very poor. They use a diversity of sources of income and rely on extensive social networks and other people. And so a wage, we shouldn't be thinking of a wage particularly in the context of one wage earner receiving it. And that's sort of about it. The point there I was making is that at the broad level, we must consider these two types of precarity, both job precarity and household precarity, and the setting of a national minimum wage must take these into consideration. Cool. Thank you very much.